Plainfield, Wisconsin, was a sanctuary of quiet normalcy until November 1957. While many fixate on the surgical shadows of Jack the Ripper, a far more visceral horror was brewing in the American heartland. Inside a derelict farmhouse smelling of cold rot and ancient wood, a flashlight flickered against the rafters. At first, the local deputies saw what looked like a dressed deer hanging from the beams, but as the beam climbed higher, the hollowed-out reality shattered the town's innocence forever. This was no animal. This was the hardware store owner, Bernice Worden. Welcome back to our investigation into the shadows of the past. Today, we deconstruct the architecture of a nightmare. To understand the monster, we must first examine the quiet town that hid him and the shifting world of forensic science that finally caught him, starting with the man they called Old Eddie. The discovery of Bernice Worden was the moment the sun set on Plainfield for the final time. For decades, this small Wisconsin town was the embodiment of the mid-century American dream, a place where trust was the primary currency and everyone was their brother's keeper. At the very heart of this social fabric was a man named Ed Gein. To the locals, he wasn't a figure of dread. He was a fixture of the community. He was the shy, eccentric bachelor who lived on the old farm, the reliable hand who helped with the harvest, and the man who often sat in the living rooms of his neighbors, minding their children while they went to town. But as the police began to strip away the layers of filth inside the Gein farmhouse, the people of Plainfield were forced to confront a terrifying reality. The harmless man they had invited into their homes was a stranger they had never truly known. This is the chilling paradox of Ed Gein. How does a man become a ghost while he is still alive? How does a human being exist in the middle of a crowded community, sharing meals and laughter, while simultaneously retreating into a psychological void so dark that the laws of nature no longer apply? This case forces us to look beyond the vicious murder of a shopkeeper and into the abyss of the human mind. It is a study in what philosophers call the banality of evil. The idea that the most gruesome stories don't always start with a monster, but with a quiet, unassuming neighbor who simply faded away. In the late 1950s, the realm of forensic science was entering a new era, transitioning from basic investigation to the deep psychological profiling that would eventually define modern criminology. But in Plainfield, the local authorities were unprepared for a criminal who didn't kill for money, revenge, or passion. Ed Gein was driven by an insatiable desire that defied every known category of deviancy. He wasn't just a killer, he was a scavenger of the dead, a man attempting to literally reconstruct a lost reality through the most macabre means imaginable. As we pull back the curtain on this investigation, we must ask ourselves how a town could be so blind. Was it a lack of forensic methods, or was it a collective psychological refusal to see the unsavory characters hiding in plain sight? The neighbors remembered Old Eddie as a man who would joke about having the girls at his house, a statement they dismissed as the ramblings of a lonely man. They saw the shell of a human being, never realizing that the man inside had long since died with his mother, leaving only a hollowed-out ghost to wander the halls of a house of horrors. To understand how Ed Gein reached this point of total moral collapse, we must travel back before the arrests, before the hardware store went quiet, and into the suffocating atmosphere of the Gein family farm. We must examine the architecture of a childhood built on religious fanaticism and isolation, where the seeds of this nightmare were first planted by the only person Ed Gein ever truly loved. To understand the creature that eventually emerged from the shadows of November 1957, we must first look at the blueprint of his soul, drafted decades earlier in the fertile yet poisoned soil of the American Midwest. The architect of this psychological ruin was a woman of iron-willed conviction, Augusta Gein. Born in 1878, Augusta was not merely a mother. She was a spiritual sentinel, a woman who viewed the entire world outside her doorstep as a cesspool of depravity and sin. To her, the rapidly industrializing America of the early 20th century was a modern-day Babylon, and she was the only one capable of keeping the whoredom of the world at bay. In 1914, Augusta made a strategic decision that would seal the fate of her family. She moved her husband and two sons, Henry and Edward, from the growing city of La Crosse to a secluded 155-acre farm on the outskirts of Plainfield. This wasn't just a change of scenery. It was a withdrawal into a fortress of isolation. By moving to the edge of the world, she ensured that her sons would have no influences other than her own. No friends, no neighbors, and certainly no women. From an editorial perspective, we see a woman utilizing a siege mindset to dismantle the social development of her children. She preached a brand of Lutheranism that fixated almost exclusively on the Old Testament, the parts filled with fire, brimstone, and the horrific consequences of moral failure. Every afternoon, while other children were playing, Ed and his brother were forced to listen to her read passages about death and divine retribution. She branded all women, except herself, as instruments of the devil and vessels of impurity. This wasn't just religious teaching, it was psychological conditioning. By the time he was a teenager, Edward Gein didn't see a community of people. He saw a landscape of walking sins. His mother's voice became his internal monologue, a constant whispering judge that dictated what was clean and what was whoredom. The farm became a psychological prison, a place where the air was thick with the scent of stagnant scripture and the suffocating presence of a woman who demanded total, absolute devotion. Yet, every fortress has a flaw, and in the Gein household, that flaw was the man who was supposed to be the protector. George Gein. If Thew Augusta was the iron pillar of the family, George was the crumbling foundation. He was a man of profound weakness, an alcoholic who struggled to hold down a job and often retreated into violent drunken rages. In the eyes of Augusta, George was the living embodiment of the unsavory characters she warned her sons about. She didn't just dislike him, she held him in a state of perpetual vocal contempt. For a young Singnang Edward Gein, the dynamic was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. He watched as his mother ridiculed his father's failures, painting George as a man of low character and even lower spirit. This created a broken mirror effect. Ed could not look to his father for a masculine identity because his father was a figure of pity and disgust. Instead, he retreated further into the shadow of Augusta, seeking her approval as the only form of safety in a house in conflict. The violence was not always physical. It was often the terrifying psychological weight of the biblical punishments Augusta promised to those who strayed. When George would stumble home in a stupor, Augusta would use it as a teaching moment, a visceral example of what happened when a man gave in to the insatiable desires of the flesh. she created a world where the only path to salvation was through her, and the only path to damnation was to be like his father. As a child, Edward was described by teachers as unusually shy and prone to sudden, strange laughter, a defense mechanism for a boy living in a state of constant high-alert anxiety. He was bullied at school for his effeminate manners, but even that pain was managed by Augusta, who told him that the cruelty of others was simply proof of their inherent evil. By his teenage years, the hierarchy of the Gein farm was absolute. At the top was Augusta, the divine voice of reason. At the bottom was George, the failed, drunken animal. And caught in the middle was Edward, a boy who was being taught that to be a man was to be a monster, and to be good was to be a permanent child of the mother. He was becoming a man without a self, a hollowed-out vessel waiting for a tragedy to finally break the seal on the darkness within. This toxic equilibrium would hold for years, a slow-motion car crash of a childhood that left Edward Gein incapable of functioning in a world of real people. But as the 1940s approached, the matriarch's fortress began to crumble as death finally visited the farm. Not for the strangers in town, but for the family themselves. And it is in these moments of grief that the first whispers of murder began to echo through the Wisconsin woods. While the Gein farmhouse remained a fortress of silence, the psychological walls began to crack as Henry Gein, the elder brother, started to commit the ultimate sin in the eyes of his family. He began to challenge Augusta. By the early 1940s, Henry was no longer a child easily swayed by fire and brimstone. He saw the isolation for what it was, a slow strangulation of their lives. He began to criticize their mother's absolute control, openly questioning her radical teachings. To Edward, this wasn't just a disagreement, it was a cosmic betrayal. His mother was the divine authority, and Henry's rebellion was nothing short of blasphemy. The tension between the brothers grew, a silent, vicious pressure building in the Wisconsin woods. Then came May 16th, 1944. It was a day that would be etched into the dark folklore of Plainfield. The brothers were out on the farm property, burning away marsh vegetation and brush, a routine chore in the rural Midwest. But as the afternoon sun began to dip, the fire supposedly grew out of control. According to Ed, the brothers became separated in the thick, acrid smoke. As the flames licked the horizon and the air grew heavy with ash, Henry vanished. When the local authorities were notified, a search party was quickly assembled. But here the narrative takes its first chilling turn. Before the volunteers could even begin a systematic sweep of the charred landscape, Edward Gein led them. He didn't wander. He didn't hesitate. He led the search party with miraculous precision directly to his brother's body. If we apply a lens of forensic skepticism, the kind that was beginning to revolutionize police work in places like Scotland Yard, the scene was a labyrinth of contradictions. The official report stated that Henry Gein had died of asphyxiation, a victim of the smoke and the fire. However, the physical evidence told a much more gruesome story. When the searchers found Henry, they noticed something that should have triggered an immediate criminal investigation. The body was found in a patch of ground that had not been touched by the fire. Despite the brush fire being the cited cause of the tragedy, there were no burns on Henry's skin. Even more disturbing were the bruises found on his head. Blunt force trauma that didn't align with a man simply overcome by smoke. In a modern investigation, These red flags would have led to an autopsy and a forensic reconstruction. But in the map Plainfield of 1944, the local coroner was not a trained forensic pathologist. The death was ruled an accident. The bruises were dismissed, and Henry was buried, his voice of rebellion silenced forever. From an editorial standpoint, we have to look at the psychological payoff for Edward. With Henry gone, the broken mirror was removed. Ed was now the sole protector of Augusta, the only son left to inhabit her shadow. The Cain and Abel parallels are impossible to ignore. A story of two brothers, a sacrifice, and a jealous devotion that ended in blood. Did Edward Theodore Gein commit his first murder a full decade before the hardware store went dark? The lack of forensic rigor at the time left us with a cold case that whispers of fratricide. If Ed did indeed kill his brother, it was a pivotal moment in his descent, a realization that the world was blind to his actions and that the ultimate way to protect the mother's fortress was through the elimination of anyone who threatened it. But the victory of being the sole son was short-lived. Nature, unlike the local police, could not be manipulated or murdered. Just a year after seeing Henry's suspicious death, the very center of Edward's universe, the matriarch herself, would face a force that even her iron will could not overcome. As the winter of 1945 approached, the final pillar of Edward's reality began to crumble, leaving him in a house that was no longer a home, but a mausoleum. And it was here, in the deafening silence of his mother's absence, that the scavenger of Plainfield truly began to take shape. With Henry Gein buried and the farm sinking into the long shadows of the Wisconsin winter, Edward Gein had finally achieved the status he had always craved. He was the sole occupant of his mother's fortress. But the victory was Pyrrhic. In late 1944, the iron will of Augusta Gein was finally betrayed by her own body. She suffered a devastating stroke that left her partially paralyzed, and for the next 12 months, Edward became her nurse, her servant, and her shadow. He tended to her every need with a devotion that bordered on the obsessive, his entire world shrinking to the size of her sickbed. Then, in 1945, a seemingly mundane event in town triggered the final collapse. They had witnessed a woman behaving in a way Augusta deemed shameful and vile. The shock of seeing such whoredom in the open was too much for her fragile system. She suffered a second massive stroke. On December 29, 1945, the iron pillar of the Gein family finally crumbled. Augusta Gein was dead. For Edward, this wasn't just a loss, it was the end of the universe. At the funeral, he was observed crying hysterically, a broken man who had lost his only connection to the living world. But it was what happened after the funeral that truly signaled his descent into madness. Instead of moving on, Edward Gein began to transform the farmhouse into a psychological mausoleum. He took hammer and nails and boarded up every room his mother had ever used. The parlor, the upstairs, and her pristine bedroom. Everything was sealed away, preserved in the exact state it was in the moment she died. He kept her rooms like a museum of the mother, a sacred shrine where the dust settled on her undisturbed Bible and the lace curtains remained frozen in time. The contrast between these sealed rooms and the rest of the house was a visceral manifestation of a fractured mind. While Augusta's space remained a temple of 19th century morality, Edward's own living quarters descended into a nightmare of filth. He moved into a single squalid room off the kitchen. Here, the banality of evil began to rot. He stopped cleaning. He stopped washing dishes. He lived among stacks of trash, rotting food, and thousands of pulp magazines. Without the anchor of Augusta's voice to guide him, Edward began to drift into a psychological void where the living and the dead occupied the same space. He was a man without a compass, a ghost haunting his own property. In the deafening silence of the farm, his insatiable desire for knowledge took a dark, forensic turn. He spent his nights reading about the atrocities of Nazi experiments, South Sea headhunters, and the intricate details of human anatomy. From an editorial perspective, we see the moment the harmless neighbor became a scavenger. He was no longer just a lonely bachelor. He was a man attempting to reconstruct a lost reality. He began to realize that if he couldn't have his mother back, he would have to find a way to create her, or at least the parts of her he missed the most. The anchor was gone. The house was a tomb. And as the moon rose over the Plainfield cemetery in the late 1940s, Edward Gein was no longer content with just reading about the dead. He was ready to go and meet them. The silence of the boarded-up farmhouse was not a resting place for Edward Gein. It was a laboratory. While the town of Plainfield believed Old Eddie was merely grieving in his squalid kitchen, a new and far more disturbing chapter was being written under the cover of the Wisconsin Nights. Between 1947 and 1952, the local cemetery became Edward's primary place of residence. He began a series of nocturnal excursions that would eventually total 40 separate trips. This was not the erratic behavior of a common thief, but a systematic, almost scientific pursuit of the dead. Just as the police in London were refining their methods of identification through fingerprints and anatomy, Edward Gein was conducting his own gruesome research into the composition of the human form. His preparation was meticulous. He didn't just dig, he studied. He spent his days immersed in pulp magazines and anatomy textbooks, learning the delicate art of skinning and preservation. When he stepped into the Plainfield cemetery, he wasn't looking for jewelry or gold. He was looking for a very specific type of raw material. The selection process revealed the depth of his fixation. Edward didn't target the young or the beautiful. He sought out middle-aged women who bore a striking resemblance to Augusta Gein. He followed the local obituaries with the focus of a scholar, waiting for the right vessel to be returned to the earth. Imagine the scene through a forensic lens. The freezing ground, the rhythmic thud of the shovel, and the transition from a grieving son to a nocturnal scavenger. He would wait until the families had gone home, until the dirt was still loose, and then he would begin the long process of exhumation. He was often accompanied by a local man of diminished capacity who believed they were merely looking for medical specimens. But for Edward, these were not specimens. They were fragments of a shattered reality he was desperate to piece back together. As we analyze these 40 trips, the sense of pity we might have felt for the lonely orphan begins to evaporate, replaced by a profound disturbance. This was a man who was becoming a surgeon of the macabre. He was learning how to remove skin without tearing it, how to preserve bone, and how to treat human remains with the same utilitarian indifference a hunter shows to a deer. The farm was no longer just a home, it was becoming a warehouse of the deceased. But why? To understand the why, we must look past the act of grave robbing and into the bizarre project that occupied Edward's mind during the long frozen winters. This was not a case of simple necrophilia. In fact, Edward Gein would later claim he never had sexual contact with the bodies because they smelled too bad. His motivation was something far more psychologically complex. It was an attempt at resurrection through skin. The most infamous element of this case is undoubtedly the woman's suit. This wasn't merely a collection of trophies. It was a garment of identity. Edward began to harvest large sections of skin from the women he exhumed, treating them with oils to keep them soft and pliable. He was crafting a second self. From an editorial perspective, this is the ultimate manifestation of his mother fixation. By creating a suit made of the skin of women who look like Augusta, Edward was attempting to literally crawl into his mother's identity. He wanted to look in the mirror and see her looking back. He wanted to occupy her space, her body and her soul so completely that the line between mother and son would vanish forever. There are reports of Edward Gein donning this suit, this mask of human flesh, and dancing in the moonlight on the isolated farm property. It was a ritual of fusion. In his mind, if he could become her, then she was never truly dead. He was attempting to defy the finality of the grave through a visceral biological reconstruction. This woman suit project explains the logic behind the horrors found later in the house. The masks made of faces, the leggings made of skin, the vests with female anatomy. These were not random acts of madness. They were pieces of a costume, a functional wardrobe designed to allow a broken man to escape his own existence. As we deconstruct this period of his life, we see the shift in the realm of forensic science that this case would eventually force. Edward Gein was a new kind of outlier. He was a man driven by a psychological, insatiable desire that wasn't found in the textbooks of the time. He was a pioneer of a different sort, a pioneer of the abyss. But as the years passed, the cemetery began to fail him. The raw materials were often too decayed, the process too laborious, and the results too far from the living warmth he craved. The transition from a scavenger to a predator was now inevitable. The Plainfield Ghoul had spent years practicing on the dead, and now he was starting to wonder what it would be like to work with the living. The stage was set for the disappearance of Mary Hogan, and the moment the harmless neighbor finally crossed the line from the grave to the gun, the nightly excursions to the cemetery had finally lost their luster. For years, the cold, silent companionship of the dead had provided Edward Gein with the raw materials he needed to reconstruct his mother's world. But as the winter of 1954 settled over the Wisconsin landscape, his focus shifted. The scavenger had become a hunter. He no longer wanted what the earth had reclaimed. He wanted the warmth of a life he could extinguish himself. His chosen target was Mary Hogan. In many ways, Mary was the antithesis of everything Augusta Gein had preached against. She was the owner of a small rustic tavern in Pine Grove, just 6 miles from the Gein farm. She was a woman of the world, loud, independent, and possessing a sharp, unfiltered tongue. To the locals, she was a fixture of the community, the kind of woman who could handle a room full of rowdy farmers with a single look. To Edward, she was a mirror of his deepest anxieties and his most violent impulses. On December 8, 1954, the tavern became a theater of the macabre. When a patron arrived later that afternoon, they found the door unlocked and the interior eerily silent. There was no sign of a struggle, but on the floor behind the bar, there was a massive pool of blood that trailed out toward the back door. Near the crimson stain lay a single spent .22 caliber shell casing. Mary Hogan had vanished into the biting winter air, leaving behind nothing but a mystery that would haunt Plainfield for years. The local authorities, led by Sheriff Arthur Schley, were baffled. In the mid-1950s, the realm of forensic science was still a distant concept in rural Wisconsin. There were no cameras, no digital footprints, and no high-tech surveillance to track a killer through the woods. The search was extensive, but the trail went cold almost immediately. Mary Hogan became a cold case, a name spoken in hushed tones, a ghost story that the town tried its best to forget. But the most terrifying aspect of the disappearance wasn't that Edward Gein hid his crime. It was that he flaunted it. This brings us to the most chilling element of Edward's psychology, what the neighbors would later call Gein humor. In the months following the murder, while the police were still searching for leads, Edward remained a fixture in the community. He still did odd jobs, he still babysat for local families, and he still sat in the town's diners. When neighbors would jokingly ask, "Hey, Eddie, whatever happened to Mary Hogan? Did she run off to the city?" Edward would look them in the eye with a shy, awkward grin and reply, "She's not missing. She's at my house right now. I've got her over there." The reaction was always the same. The neighbors would roar with laughter. They would slap him on the back and shake their heads at old Eddie's weird, eccentric sense of humor. They thought it was a joke. The harmless, bumbling ramblings of a lonely bachelor who didn't know how to talk to people. They couldn't conceive that the man who helped them carry their groceries was actually giving them a literal gruesome confession. This is the essence of the banality of evil. We expect monsters to hide in the shadows, to speak in riddles, or to possess the insatiable desire of a cinematic villain. But Edward Gein stood in the daylight, looked his neighbors in the eye, and told them exactly what he had done. And they laughed, because the truth was too horrific to be believed. From an editorial perspective, we see a community blinded by the neighborly mask. Because Edward didn't fit the mold of the unsavory characters they had been warned about. He was invisible. For 3 years, Mary Hogan's face remained in the Gein farmhouse, not as a memory, but as a physical mask that Edward would wear during his moonlight rituals. He had crossed the ultimate threshold. He had taken a life, and he had discovered that the world was too blind to stop him. But as history has shown us, the predator's arrogance often leads to a final, fatal lapse in judgment. As 1957 approached, Edward's vicious murders were no longer enough to satisfy the void left by his mother. He needed one more transaction, one more vessel to complete his collection. And this time, he would choose a victim whose disappearance would finally force the people of Plainfield to stop laughing and start looking at the blood on old Eddie's hands. The transaction was about to begin. The product? A gallon of antifreeze. The price? The final shred of Plainfield's innocence. The laughter of the diners in Plainfield was about to be silenced by the cold, metallic click of a trigger. Saturday, November 16th, 1957, should have been a morning of quiet anticipation. It was the opening day of the deer hunting season in Wisconsin, a high holy day for the rural Midwest. Most of the men in Plainfield had already vanished into the thickets and woods before dawn, rifles in hand, leaving the town nearly deserted. Among those left behind, was Bernice Worden, a 58-year-old widow and the steadfast owner of Worden's Hardware. She opened her shop as she had done for years, unaware that the predator she had known for decades was no longer satisfied with the silence of the cemetery. At approximately 8:30 a.m., the bell above the door chimed. Shuffling into the store was the man the town called Old Eddie. To Bernice, he was just another customer, albeit a strange one. He wasn't dressed for the hunt. He was there for a transaction. He asked for a gallon of antifreeze. As we reconstruct the events through a procedural lens, the ticking clock of this tragedy begins to accelerate. Bernice turned her back to Ed Gein, perhaps reaching for a jug on the shelf or leaning over her sales ledger to record the purchase. In that moment, the harmless neighbor reached for a .22 caliber rifle he had brought with him. There was no struggle, no shouted warning, and no plea for mercy. A single shot rang out, muffled by the heavy stacks of winter supplies and the dense morning fog clinging to the storefront windows. Bernice Worden fell behind the counter, the victim of a vicious murder that was as clinical as it was cold. But Edward was not a man of impulse. He was a man of ritual. With the practiced ease of a scavenger who had spent 40 nights exhuming the dead, he began the process of dressing his prize. He didn't flee the scene. He moved with a terrifying, utilitarian calm. He dragged Bernice's body toward the rear of the store, leaving a thick, visceral trail of blood across the worn wooden floorboards. He loaded her into the store's own truck, then transferred her to his own vehicle, and vanished back toward the isolated farmhouse that had become a warehouse of horrors. He even took the time to lock the hardware store behind him, a final chilling act of normalcy, before retreating into the shadows. The hours passed. The sun climbed and began its descent, yet the hardware store remained dark. At 5 p.m., Frank Worden, Bernice's son and a deputy sheriff, returned from his hunting trip. He expected to find his mother closing up shop. Instead, he found a building that felt wrong. The lights were on, the door was locked, but the interior was a void of silence. Using his own key, Frank entered. His training as a lawman immediately collided with his instincts as a son. He saw the empty counter. He saw the floor. And then he saw the blood. This is where the shifting world of forensic science meets the simplicity of small-town bookkeeping. In 1957, Plainfield didn't have the sophisticated labs of Scotland Yard, but it had the paper trail of a meticulously run business. Frank Worden approached the sales counter and opened the ledger book. The last entry, written in his mother's familiar hand just before her death, was for 1 gallon of antifreeze. The name listed on the receipt was Edward Gein. In a moment of profound clarity, the Gein humor that the town had laughed at for years suddenly curdled. Frank remembered Edward joking about the girls at his house. He remembered the strange disappearances of the past 3 years. The neighborly mask didn't just slip, it shattered. Sheriff Arthur Schley was notified immediately. A manhunt was not necessary. They knew exactly where an old Eddie would be. He was a creature of habit, a man who believed he was invisible because he was so unremarkable. While the police mobilized, Edward was found at a neighbor's house, having just finished a calm, pleasant dinner. When they apprehended him, he didn't fight. He didn't even seem surprised. He was the same docile, shy bachelor he had always been. But as the police cruisers sped toward the Gein farmhouse, the investigation was about to transition from a missing persons case into a descent into a literal hell on earth. They had the suspect, and they had the receipt for the antifreeze. What they didn't have was any inkling of what was waiting for them behind the boarded-up windows of that derelict farm. The final transaction had been completed. The price had been paid in blood. And as the flashlights finally breached the darkness of Edward's home, the world was about to discover that the deer hanging in the shed was only the beginning of the nightmare. The antifreeze receipt had provided the map, but nothing could have prepared the authorities for the destination. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that frigid November evening, a small convoy of police cruisers navigated the rutted frozen path leading to the Ed Gein farmhouse. The air was still, biting, and carried a silence that felt heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. For the neighbors, this was just the old Ed Gein place, a bit dilapidated, a bit lonely. But as Sheriff Arthur Schley stepped onto the porch, the neighborly mask of the property began to dissolve. The initial search was not a swift, tactical entry. It was a slow, stumbling descent into a sensory void. When the officers pushed open the door, they weren't met by a killer in wait, but by an assault of the senses that nearly drove them back. There was no electricity in the house. The air was thick with a stagnant, acrid stench, a mix of wood smoke, rotting biological matter, and years of accumulated filth. It was the smell of a tomb that had been inhabited by the living. With only their flashlights to pierce the gloom, the officers found themselves navigating a labyrinth of trash. Piles of old newspapers, pulp magazines, and rusted cans rose up like jagged cliffs, narrowing the hallways into claustrophobic tunnels. The flickering beams of their lights caught the edges of kerosene lamps, their glass blackened by soot, casting long distorted shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Every step crunching on the debris felt like an intrusion into a mind that had long since abandoned the concept of order. While some officers began the grim task of clearing the main house, Sheriff Arthur Schley and Deputy Frank Worden moved toward the summer kitchen and the adjacent woodshed. It was here, in the freezing darkness of the outbuilding, that the quiet town illusion was finally, violently shattered. As Schley swung his flashlight toward the rafters, the beam illuminated something large, pale, and hanging by its heels from a crossbeam. At first glance, in the chaotic play of light and shadow, the sheriff's brain reached for a rational explanation. It was opening day of deer season, after all. He thought he was looking at a dressed deer, hollowed out and prepared for the butcher. But as he moved closer, the flickering light revealed the horrific truth. The deer had no fur. It had hands. It had been decapitated and eviscerated with surgical clinical precision. This was not a trophy from the woods. This was Bernice Worden. The visceral horror of that discovery sent a shockwave through the search party. Frank Worden, standing just feet away, was forced to confront the sight of his mother treated like a piece of livestock. It was a moment of profound psychological trauma that would define the case. The banality of evil had manifested as a slaughterhouse in the backyard of a man who was supposed to be a friend. The slow-burn pacing of the investigation had reached its first terrible high point. They had found the body, but as the flashlight beams returned to the main house, the investigators realized that Bernice was only the final entry in a much larger, much darker ledger. Leaving the slaughterhouse behind, the authorities returned to the interior of the farmhouse, their flashlights now tools of a grim forensic inventory. If the woodshed was the site of the act, the house was the gallery where the results were displayed. As they moved from the kitchen into the small living area Edward Gein occupied, the investigators began to encounter the artifacts of madness. The first thing that caught the light was a chair. To a casual observer, it might have looked like an old, poorly upholstered piece of furniture, but as the officers leaned in, they realized the fabric was not leather or velvet. It was human skin, stretched taut over the frame and stitched with a utilitarian indifference that suggested the maker viewed the material as nothing more than a durable textile. This wasn't the work of a man in a frenzy. It was the work of a craftsman who had spent years refining his methods. On the kitchen table, the beams of light illuminated a set of bowls. In a normal home, these would be vessels for soup or cereal. But in the house of Edward Gein, they were the inverted tops of human skulls. Some had been sawed off with jagged edges, while others were polished smooth, used as everyday implements in a life that had completely decoupled from the sanctity of the human form. The juxtaposition was staggering. The most mundane household objects created from the most sacred remains. As the search continued, the inventory of depravity grew. They found lampshades where the parchment had been replaced by translucent, tanned human skin. They found wastebaskets made of the same material. Every corner of the room revealed another item that turned a common domestic setting into a warehouse of the deceased. The punchline to this horrific display was the sheer normality with which these items were used. There were no altars, no ritual candles, no signs of worship. These were simply things old Eddie used to live his life. He sat on the skin. He ate from the bone. From an editorial perspective, this is the most disturbing element of the Gein case. He hadn't just murdered or exhumed, he had integrated death into the very fabric of his domestic existence. He had transformed the vicious murders and gruesome stories into a quiet, functional reality that he inhabited every single day. The officers moved through the rooms with a growing sense of nausea, realizing that every object they touched could be a fragment of a missing person. They were no longer looking for a killer. They were cataloging the contents of a nightmare that had been under construction for over a decade. But the most macabre discoveries were not the pieces of furniture. They were the items found in the dresser drawers and hidden in trunks, the wardrobe of Edward Gein. This was where the craftsmanship of the Plainfield Ghoul reached its peak, and where the shock value for the investigators became almost unbearable. Deep inside a wooden chest, the police found what appeared to be a collection of masks, but these were not made of plastic or paper. They were the actual faces of women, carefully removed and preserved. Among them was the face of Mary Hogan, the tavern owner who had vanished 3 years prior. The skin had been treated with motor oil to keep it pliable, and some of the masks still bore traces of lipstick and makeup, as if Edward were trying to maintain the illusion of life. Then they found the woman suit. This was the centerpiece of his obsession, a complete set of leggings made from the skin of human legs and a torso vest crafted from the chest of a woman, including the breasts. It was a garment designed to be worn, a second skin that would allow Edward to physically transform into his mother. The technical detail involved was staggering. He had learned how to tan the skin, how to stitch the sections together, and how to maintain the biological integrity of the suit through the harsh Wisconsin winters. The investigators also discovered a belt made entirely of human nipples and a box containing 9 female biological organs, some of which had been painted with silver and gold. There were necklaces made of human lips and a pull cord for a window shade that ended in a pair of human lips. This was the point where the insatiable desire of Edward Gein became clear to the forensic mind. This was not just a collection of trophies. This was a functional costume for a psychological resurrection. He wasn't just wearing the dead. He was attempting to wear the identity of the one person he had ever truly loved. The woman suit was his armor against a world without Augusta. As the officers held these items in the flickering light, the reality of the 40 cemetery trips and the 2 murders coalesced into a single terrifying image. A man dancing in the moonlight on a lonely farm, dressed in the skin of the exhumed, trying to find his mother in the reflection of a dirty mirror. The craftsmanship was a testament to a mind that had spent thousands of hours in the dark, obsessed with the tactile sensation of the deceased. The final phase of the search involved the most grueling task of all, the biological inventory. Beyond the furniture and the wardrobe, the investigators began to find the remains that hadn't been crafted into anything yet. In the kitchen, near the stove, they found a frying pan containing a human heart, the heart of Bernice Worden, which Edward had apparently planned to consume. In various cardboard boxes and jars scattered throughout the squalid rooms, the police discovered a horrific archive of body parts. There were containers filled with female genitals, some preserved in salt, others left to rot. There were hands, feet, and organs that had been discarded or kept for future projects. The struggle for the investigators was not just the physical revulsion, but the forensic impossibility of the scene. They were faced with the daunting task of identifying which parts belonged to the 2 murder victims and which had been taken from the 40 graves Edward had violated over the years. In 1957, without the aid of modern DNA analysis or sophisticated anthropometric records, it was a nightmare of identification. They had to cross-reference the parts with the local cemetery records, trying to determine whose mother or grandmother had been harvested to create the artifacts found in the house. The emotional impact on the search party was profound. These were men from a small, tight-knit community where everyone was a neighbor. Now, they were standing in a room filled with the desecrated remains of the people they had known, loved, and buried. The sheer scale of the desecration was a violation of the town's collective soul. From a forensic standpoint, the Gein house was a watershed moment. It forced a realization that the quiet neighbor could harbor a level of depravity that was previously unimaginable in the American heartland. As the sun rose the next morning, the House of Horrors was no longer a local secret. The world was about to learn about Edward Theodore Gein, and the Plainfield Ghoul would become a permanent scar on the history of criminal psychology. The search was ending, but the aftermath was just beginning. The biological inventory was complete. The artifacts of madness were crated away, and the man who had built this shrine to the dead was sitting in a jail cell, waiting for the interrogation that would attempt to explain how a human being could fall so far into the abyss. While the flashlights in the farmhouse continued to illuminate the fragments of a shattered community, the man at the center of the storm was sitting in the sterile fluorescent light of an interrogation room. The contrast between the House of Horrors and the physical presence of Edward Theodore Gein was perhaps the most unsettling discovery of the entire investigation. The officers who had just witnessed a slaughterhouse in the Wisconsin woods expected to face a monster, a snarling, vicious killer who mirrored the depravity of his home. Instead, they found Old Eddie. He sat in his chair with a submissive, almost childlike posture, his hands folded neatly, his face wearing a shy, apologetic grin that felt entirely detached from the crimes he was accused of. During the initial hours of questioning, the investigators were met with a demeanor that was polite, docile, and surprisingly cooperative. Edward didn't shout. He didn't demand a lawyer. He didn't even seem to understand the gravity of the situation. He spoke in a soft, high-pitched voice, often punctuating his sentences with a nervous, fluttering giggle. To the seasoned lawman, it was a masterclass in psychological dissonance. They were looking at a man who had treated human beings like livestock, yet he was asking for a glass of milk and worrying about whether his neighbors would think poorly of him. The interrogation, led by Sheriff Arthur Schley, moved with a slow, deliberate pacing. At first, Edward maintained a wall of denial that felt more like a mental fog than a strategic lie. When asked about Bernice Worden, he simply shook his head, insisting that he was just a bystander, a man who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He spoke of his neighborly mask as if it were his only reality. But as the evidence was presented, the antifreeze receipt, the blood in the truck, and eventually the photographs of the house, the "I didn't do it" narrative began to dissolve into something far more complex. Ed Gein entered a phase of psychological retreat. He didn't confess in the traditional sense. He began to claim a profound, selective amnesia. "I don't remember," became his mantra. When shown the artifacts found in his home, he would tilt his head, looking at the images of masks and skin as if he were seeing them for the first time. He would whisper, "I might have done that. I don't know. It's all like a dream." From an editorial perspective, we see a man whose mind had created a series of compartments to survive his own depravity. In one compartment, he was the harmless odd job man. In the other, he was the scavenger of the dead. During the interrogation, these two worlds were forced to collide, and the result was a total mental collapse. He described his grave-robbing excursions not as acts of desecration, but as trances. He claimed that on those 40 nights at the cemetery, he was merely following a compulsion he couldn't name, an insatiable desire to be near the dead that felt as natural as breathing. The investigators realized they weren't dealing with a criminal mastermind, but with a human being who had completely decoupled from the shared reality of society. His politeness was not a ruse. It was the only social skin he had left. As the interrogation ended, the question shifted from, "What did he do?" to, "What is he?" The answer to that question would launch Plainfield and the state of Wisconsin into a legal labyrinth that would take over a decade to resolve. In the late 1950s, the realm of forensic science was beginning to acknowledge that the traditional definitions of sanity were ill-equipped to handle an outlier like Edward Gein. Almost immediately after his arrest, Edward was subjected to a battery of psychological evaluations. The results were a grim inventory of a broken mind. Psychiatrists diagnosed him with schizophrenia and a profound sexual psychopathy rooted in his mother fixation. They described a man who functioned at a high level of technical skill, as evidenced by his tanning and crafting, but who possessed the emotional maturity of a toddler. On January 6, 1958, the legal proceedings hit a significant roadblock. Edward Gein was found unfit for trial due to insanity. In the eyes of the law, he was unable to understand the charges against him or participate in his own defense. He was committed to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. This ruling sent a wave of frustration through the community. The people of Plainfield wanted justice. They wanted a conviction. They wanted the monster to be officially labeled. Instead, they watched as Old Eddie was ushered into a clinical environment where he would spend the next 10 years as a model patient. He was described by hospital staff as gentle, quiet, and obsessed with doing his assigned chores perfectly. It was as if the matriarch's fortress had simply been replaced by a state institution, and Edward was content to live in the shadow of a new authority. As the years passed, the legal battle became a study in the intersection of law and mental health. By 1968, doctors determined that Edward had reached a state of competency through medication and therapy. The trial for the murder of Bernice Worden finally began, presided over by Judge Robert H. Ghoul. The trial was a cinematic reconstruction of the nightmare. Because Edward had waived his right to a jury, the judge was the sole arbiter of his fate. The evidence was overwhelming. The forensic link between the .22 rifle and the victim, the biological remains, and the mountain of artifacts. The defense didn't argue the facts. They argued the intent. They painted a picture of a man who was a victim of his own biology and his mother's fanaticism. On November 14, 1968, Judge Ghoul delivered a verdict that reflected the complexities of the case. Edward Gein was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Bernice Worden. However, the judge immediately followed this with a second ruling. Edward was not guilty by reason of insanity. From a historical reporting style, we see the judicial system struggling to balance the visceral need for punishment with the scientific reality of mental illness. Edward was returned to the state hospital, where he was ordered to spend the rest of his natural life. He would never face a prison cell. He would only face the clean white walls of a clinic. The legal labyrinth had reached its end, but the questions it raised remained unanswered. Had the system failed the victims? Or had it properly identified a man who was simply too broken to be held accountable by human laws? Edward Gein had survived the interrogation and the trial, but he remained a captive of the abyss he had created in his own mind. The physical artifacts of his crimes were being destroyed, the house burned, the items sold. But the psychological profile of the Plainfield Ghoul was now a permanent part of the forensic landscape. As the 1960s drew to a close, Old Eddie was a forgotten man in a hospital bed, but the legend of what he had done was just beginning to catch fire in the world of pop culture. The vicious murders were over, but the fire in Plainfield was about to claim the final piece of the Gein legacy, leaving nothing behind but the ashes of a nightmare. The stolen headstone of Edward Gein serves as a final haunting testament to a man who refused to stay buried in the collective consciousness. Decades have passed since the smoke cleared from the Plainfield farm, but the echo remains. We often search for monsters in the dark corners of our imagination, looking for the vicious killers in the shadows of history. But the case of Ed Gein taught us a far more terrifying lesson. The most dangerous people are often the most unremarkable. He was the man who helped you carry your groceries, the neighbor who watched your children, the harmless bachelor who offered a shy smile across a garden fence. Gein didn't have the calculated malice of a criminal mastermind. He was a product of isolation and a mind that had become its own psychological tomb. He didn't hide in the darkness. He hid in plain sight, wearing the mask of a friendly neighbor. Plainfield eventually reclaimed its silence, but its innocence was shattered forever. Forensic science has advanced, giving us DNA and psychological profiling. Yet we still find ourselves asking the same haunting question. How well do we really know the people living right next door? The true horror of Ed Gein is the realization that the line between the neighbor and the monster is thinner than we dare to believe. The most terrifying ghosts aren't the ones in our closets. They are the ones who offer to help us carry the weight of our daily lives. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the abyss. Until next time, keep watching the shadows.